2021 didn't really start off very well, especially when you visit American Twitter. But allow me to distract you from the emptiness that is the real world that we're living in to talk about weeb stuff. So let's talk about the Fate franchise. I've already done a video where I played through the entire visual novel of Fate Stay Night just to dispel the notion that the Fate series is really hard to get into. I'm not even a fan of the series, I'm just someone who likes good stories and Sakura's nice pair of milkers. And yet I've come to realize that playing the actual visual novel is something that a lot of Fate fans have never really gotten themselves into, because compared to the amount of video games, anime, merchandise, and X-rated content this franchise spawned, the visual novel is about as accessible as a rotary phone to your average Zoomer. And that's a shame, because the visual novel is legitimately great. It's just that trying to get a legal copy of the goddamn thing, finding the updated Rialta Nua version, and installing the English patch will definitely turn people off, especially when all they get at the end is a visual novel and therefore boring. Well, screw those Zoomers and boomers who can't read readmes for their life. I for one enjoy visual novels, and Fate is certainly one of the big players, alongside Muv-Luv, which I'll probably get into sometime in the distant future. But putting Fate aside, Type Moon has produced quite a lot of stuff, and aside from the massive sprawling Fate franchise that still grows like a freaking tumor, there are also other works in this so-called Nasuverse, named after its mastermind Kinoko Nasu, that also has dark stories full of intrigue, magic, blood, and anime girls with questionable legality. Except instead of connecting them in a serious Avengers-like crossover, they connect them by a slice-of-life comedy, presumably while smoking a lot of crack. We've talked about Fate Stay Night, so let's talk about the other side of the carnival phantasm. Tsukihime, also known as Moon Princess, is a visual novel that puts Type Moon and Kinoko Nasu on the map, and yet it still got completely overshadowed by their more successful billion-dollar franchise. One of the most prominent memes among Fate and Type Moon fans is the notion that Type Moon's early works, such as Tsukihime, will not get any sorts of remake anytime soon, especially when they only announced it around, 2008? And even promising one route that got cut off of the story. But lo and behold, the Mad Lads actually did it. Just recently, it's been announced that Tsukihime is actually getting a real and proper remake, and they're gonna be released on the PS4 and the Switch, complete with HD graphics, better soundtrack, and all of its X-rated scenes either removed or censored in some way, because of course they would be. It's one of the risks of a visual novel developer getting more mainstream, and trying to appeal to as many people as possible by releasing it to consoles that don't sell adult games with X-rated content, except the Western ones, obviously. So instead of preparing for a massive disappointment because they don't have the X-rated scenes, especially the non-consensual ones that are actually important for the story, let's talk about the original, untainted version. The story of Tsukihime centralizes in Shiki Tona, who, like almost every anime protagonist ever, is an ordinary high school student and a virgin, but not for long, at least in the original. This time, he has eyes that can see through the cracks in the lines in the world that highlights their weaknesses, an ability called the Mystic Eyes of Depth Perception. Any sharp object that gets through those lines will crumble into pieces, including human beings. In fact, living things like human beings have a big weak spot where you can stab them and then they'll die. Kinda like the weak points of a video game boss. The problem with this Mystic Eyes is that he can't just turn it off like it's Sharingan or something, and he doesn't really like seeing the world in loads and loads of lines. In fact, he tried to claw his eyes out at one point. So, mysterious stranger, whom he referred to as Sensei, gave him magical glasses that allow him to see the world normally, but this Sensei figure eventually disappears into God knows where, and to never be seen again. Or at least until the epilogue, or you watch an ecchi anime next door, or play Melty Blood, or wait until the prequel gets an English release. Anyway, Shiki has lived with another branch family of the Tonos for years before finally returning to the mansion where his sister Akiha is living alongside Hisui and Kohaku, twin mates with radically different personalities. From this point on, the game has two main stories with 5 different variations depending on the characters being chosen to focus on. The near end focuses on a vampire story and has 2 characters that mix the story up. Arcuade, a vampire girl, and CL, no not that CL, this CL, Shiki Senpai, who has loads of secrets. The far end focuses more on the dark secrets within Shiki's family, and it varies depending on which of the mansion's inhabitants that you want to focus on, namely Akiha, Hisui, and Kohaku. In any case, the town that Shiki inhabits is terrorized by serial killers that suck blood like vampires, so can Shiki stop these vampires with these other characters? What kind of dark secret that he will uncover ahead? How many editions of Melty Blood do we need to flesh out about this story. So what are my thoughts on Tsukihime? Well, this is one of Type Moon's early works, and like a lot of creators' early works, there are things that are quite rough around the edges, the most significant of which are the visuals, which is pretty much half of what makes a visual novel. I'd like to apologize to my dear viewers that the screenshots that I've been showing to you are actually from the remake trailer animated by Ufotable, because of course it is, and some screenshots are straight from their comedy anime Carnival Phantasm, which is a crossover between Fate and Melty Blood, which was based on Tsukihime. This is for the sake of making you a lot more familiar with the modern renditions of the characters so that you people don't get shocked when we switch into the original designs in 3, 2, 1, boom! There's the actual Tsukihime visual novel. Look at those rough renders. 4:3 resolution, barely any options in the menu, the not so polished CG and character design. This really does reeks of early works, a lot more so than Fate was, but Fate was at least more polished. This will certainly turn off quite a lot of the zoomers out there, especially those who can't look at the character designs and go, wow, that looks like an early 2000s anime. But why am I trying to judge an early 2000s visual novel on its early 2000s character designs? Some people are actually a fan of those and prefer that over its modernized design. Can relate. But hey, visuals are only half of the component of a visual novel, so what about the actual novel of the visual novel part? Well, I actually really enjoyed it. While it's not the best visual novel I played, it is at least well written and enjoyable to read through. It has a lot of the dark fantasy elements of Fate, but a lot less of its comedic anime touch, for the most part at least. The premise of the story is really nothing that special. It's about vampires, ghouls, demonic rituals, possessions, all of that dark fantasy stuff. And yet the funny thing is, you don't actually know what it is about and where it's going until at least a quarter way through. And even when you sort of get where they're coming from, the story will do a great job in going, psych, turns out it's not about what you're thinking of. It does so quite successfully in almost every new route, which highlights the story's unpredictability. That being said, the game loves to dump loads and loads of expositions to you, and they're dumping it over explanations of things that really don't need a lot of explanations. There are loads of text involving various organizations and factions and all of that, but we never actually see them, or at least to any significant degree. Every time exposition happens, the characters might as well blow raspberries in their mouths for the amount of good the information give to us. Type Moon always loves to overcomplicate things that are actually not that complicating and shouldn't even be made complicating. It's something that I noticed when I play Fate 2. It's a simple story about Battle Royale over the Holy Grail being made a lot more complicating with so much more unnecessary nonsense. To be fair to Tsukihime, summarizing it is slightly more complicating, but that's only because there are two central stories. The near-end route is about hunting vampires and other monsters. That's pretty much it really, but there are loads of information about factions and vampire biology stuff that the game dumps at you that at the end of the day aren't really that important. I know it's done to fill in the universe with a lot more content and world building, which I'm sure is well realized and a lot of thought is being put into it because this is Type Moon and world building is something that they really love to do, but what it only ends up doing is turning off everyone who just wants the story to get it over with. This isn't really that much of an issue in the far end routes, but that's because you can only get to the far end routes if you complete at least one of the near end routes, which means you already get some of the information and you get where the entire thing is going for. That and the far end routes involve concepts that are slightly easier to comprehend and keeps the story to characters that are close to Shiki, which is not very far end if you think about it. And that brings me to what I really love about Type Moon's writing. Despite its tendency to dump loads of exposition text on your face, they still put a lot of effort to make the characters and their relationships believable and relatable. All of the routes did an incredible job at making you to sympathize and root for the characters. Despite filling up almost every generic anime protagonist checklist, Shiki is actually a really good protagonist, one that isn't afraid of making decisions for himself and sacrifice his own life to save his loved ones. He has all the traits that made me love Shiro in Fate as well, in that he actually plays an active role in the story rather than passively going through it and saying yes, yes, yes to everything. I love how in some moments in the game he basically turned into a male tsundere, who you can have the option to hook up with your tsundere sister so you can enter some sort of tsundere singularity. My favorite one has to be CL's route. It's not just because CL is a genuinely caring and loving senpai character, but it's also because the story did a great job in making a badass character who is also tragic and sympathetic. In fact, both CL and Arcuade fall in that category, and despite their hostility towards each other, which was greatly exaggerated to comedic effect in Carnival Phantasm, they're actually the same deep down. Kohaku's route, which is the final route, also shows how cunning and manipulative she is, but at the same time, her conquest is something that I actually get and sympathize with, and not to mention controversial. I don't know what kind of bad CGI dragon or mana transfer censorship the remake is gonna pull with her backstory. The moment you sugarcoat it with something more family-friendly type moon is where all of that emotional impact is lost. What I do have issues with are the endings. Without spoiling too much, some of the characters' true ending lead into a conclusion that isn't really happy or good per se, which is why there's a good ending for most of them, and there are some good endings that I prefer over the true endings. That's the thing about visual novels, and that whatever the developer considers to be the best or the most canon of conclusion is according to the developer's opinions and not the players, and you're gonna have to accept it, even if it's bad. And here's another thing about Tsukihime, it's a little bit shorter. Fate Stay Night took me about 12 hours to complete for every route, which totals to 36 hours of the entire visual novel, and that's with instant text and zero voice. One route in Tsukihime should take you around 6 hours at most, and there are 5 routes, so that's around 30 hours of total content, and that's even if you skip through a lot of the already seen dialogues. In conclusion, there are loads of things to talk about Tsukihime, including its lore and world building and the franchise it spawned, but at the end of the day, it's mostly a dark fantasy vampire story. Tsukihime is without a doubt Type Moon's early works, and it shows, or at least on a technical level. The visuals and audio could have been better, and there are significantly less options to control a lot of the game's mechanics, but this is the early 2000s, so what do you expect? That being said, the story is incredibly solid. The characters are nice and well-rounded. It has the Type Moon dark fantasy writing that manages to dip their toes into the horror territory at times, and by dip their toes, I mean completely dive in, because it's a vampire story, so of course it has loads of horror in it. And if you're tired of the whole thing being too dark, just watch Carnival Phantasm and smoke a lot of crack, because the creators of this anime certainly did. The news of the remake certainly excites me, and I'll probably do one on that, or at least when the English version pops up, because I do want to know how they're going to do the X-rated scenes, as some of them are legitimately crucial to the story. Tsukihime spawned a franchise of its own, and several crossovers and spin-off. It spawned Melty Blood, a fighting game featuring characters from Tsukihime and some more, and Melty Blood in turn became the spiritual predecessor for Under Night in Birth, and unlike the Tsukihime visual novel, Melty Blood is actually sold on Steam, whereas the original Tsukihime visual novel is a bit more difficult to find and purchase, to the point where you probably had to resort to less legal means to get it. Should you play Tsukihime? Well, if you're a fan of Fate Stay Night and you have breezed through the visual novel, then this one is definitely for you. For the rest of you guys, it's a little bit hard to get into, and I can totally understand why you put it off after a couple of hours in, which is a shame because there are loads of good stuff in it. You need to have a walkthrough on hand too, because otherwise you're gonna be brought into a Tiger Dojo-like session where CL scolds you for being a scrub. Otherwise, I enjoyed Tsukihime. Now, if you'll excuse me, allow me to forget the complexities of current year so that I can see Shiki being a clueless chick magnet.